It also talks about 360-degree holiness, and that's a term I'm beginning to work through, and in fact, road testing it on you. And what that broadly is about, and it sets out where we're going to go over the next few days, is to say that as we reflect on issues of holiness, we end up going in 360 degrees. That holiness is rooted in God. That we are seeking to experience something of God's holiness in our own lives. But when we do that, it draws us back to God. And so over the next few days, we are hopefully going to make that loop, that 360 loop, which holiness is always about in my own view. So today we talk about models of holiness in the Old Testament. And by the end of the session, I'm hoping that you'll have an understanding of different models of holiness across different strands of the Old Testament, and be able to outline in your own minds a little more clearly why it was that holiness was significant for Israel's covenant relationship. Now, first of all, we need to spend a little time talking about methodology, because our aim is quite ambitious. To think about Old Testament models of holiness, or of anything, to be honest, when the Old Testament is compiled over generations, compiled by a variety of authors reflecting a range of interests, the Old Testament will offer no single unified view on holiness, or indeed on any other topic for that matter. Rather, we will get different nuances deriving from different parts of the Old Testament. John Gabby, in his book Holiness in Israel, he argues that holiness was expressed in different ways, with different emphases in different parts of the Old Testament. So he says for the prophets, it was social justice; for the priests, it was proper ritual and maintenance of separation; and for the wisdom tradition of the sages, it was inner integrity and individual moral acts. Now, whether you agree with Gabby or not, it seems to me that idea that there are different strands within the Old Testament which have different nuances and views is a helpful way into this topic. And so what we're doing today is to try to explore holiness from these three viewpoints: priestly tradition, prophetic tradition, wisdom tradition. Even at the same time of doing that, of course, we also recognize that there is no absolutely unified view within any of those traditions. But sticking with methodology for a moment, one of the things I'm doing is drawing upon the work of a scholar called Gavin Flood. He's not a theologian, he's someone who studies the phenomenology of religion. And he says this, you may not agree with it, but let's run with it for a moment. He says that religion constitutes value-laden narratives and behaviors that bind the people together, to each other, and to non-empirical claims and beings. And what he goes on to say, and this is the bit that is important for me, he says religious identity constitutes a binding category, but that it is not necessarily a very tightly defined category. So, for example, if I ask you to define what Hinduism is, it's very difficult to offer a watertight definition of what that is. But that's not the same thing as saying that there is no such thing as Hinduism. So it is when we spend time talking about priestly tradition, or prophetic tradition, or wisdom tradition, you will notice at no point do I stop to define precisely what I mean by that. Nor do I give you a list of books or a list of chapters within books to say this bit is priestly tradition and that bit is prophetic tradition. It's not a tightly defined category. But that's not to suggest for a moment that it's not without meaning. And of course the reality is I'm not really interested in prophetic holiness or priestly holiness or wisdom tradition holiness. What I'm interested in is Old Testament holiness. And I'm using these traditions as a lens, as a window through which we can look at texts we can interrogate texts and hopefully come to a clearer view by discerning these multiple voices on holiness which are rooted in a single Israelite tradition. And what I'm hoping at the end, of course, then, is to be able to draw together these common strands to say, these are some nuances which emerge out of priestly tradition. Here are some more which emerge from prophetic tradition. Here are some more that emerge from wisdom tradition. And then to pull these together to form a composite sketch of what we might mean when we say, this is an Old Testament view of holiness. Does that sort of make sense about where we're going today? Right, so having talked about methodology, let's get down to business. So let's talk about holiness in priestly tradition. And we talked a little bit about this last night, if you were here, when we looked at Leviticus 19, verse 2. But in fact, Leviticus has a significant holiness code within it, which runs from chapter 17 to 26. I think it comes to its high point in chapter 19, where the command is given, you shall be holy, for I am holy. But that is by no means the only place where Leviticus engages with the issue. Jacob Milgrom, in his 3-volume commentary on Leviticus, says this. He says the theme of the entire book of Leviticus is holiness. The theme of the entire book is holiness. Alan Ross, in his book Holiness to the Lord, says this: Leviticus was and remains one of the most important books of the Old Testament. It not only presents the entire religious system of ancient Israel, but it also lays the theological foundation for the New Testament teaching about the atoning work of Jesus Christ. We don't get Jesus if we don't get some of the things that are going on in Leviticus. And then there is Jensen. Jensen says this, Philip Jensen, that there are 5 different nuances that emerge from priestly writings when we think about holiness. And so here are the 5. First, the idea of holiness as separation. That's perhaps the most common one. And separation is understood negatively and positively. So negatively, separation away from that which is impure, but also positively, separation towards God. So that's number 1. Number 2, he says, holiness in priestly tradition is understood in terms of energy or destructive power. So whether it's consuming fire or burning bush, or the dangerous cloud, or the pillar of fire on Mount Sinai, you get this idea of holiness as energy or destructive power. And then third, the idea of holiness as that which is completely other. Now, the holy is completely separate and transcendent from that which is worldly. If you've come across a book by a chap called Rudolf Otto, a classic book of holiness called The Idea of the Holy, if you've never read it, approach with caution. It does take some wrapping your head around. But that's broadly his classic argument. That when we think about the holiness of God, we're talking about something that is transcendent. Fourth, the idea of realm or sphere of belonging. Now, holiness refers to anything or anyone that belongs to God's sphere or God's realm. And fifth, we talked about this last night, the idea of divine quintessence. That holiness, whatever we mean or understand by holy, is the core of God's very being, the core of who God is. And what we're going to do then is to unpack some of those together, and we'll put the the third and fourth together. So the idea of that which is completely other, and that which belongs to God's sphere, is broadly talking about the same sort of things. So we'll look at 4 areas in holiness as priestly, within priestly tradition. So holiness as separation. Come ye apart and be ye separate. That we gravitate towards. It's the most well-known element of priestly tradition. And John Campbell says that holiness demands separation. And that idea of holiness requiring separation is pervasive in the priestly traditions of the Bible from the book of Genesis onwards.
to Numbers 5, 1-4, Numbers 6, 1-12, Leviticus 22, 1-9, Deuteronomy 23, 9-14. In all of those texts, we get a very clear indication of holiness requiring separation. That much, no big deal.
The question for me is, why? Why is it that holiness requires separation? One possibility is to do with the fact that the holy, or the sphere of the holy, is somehow fragile. If something that is impure enters a holy space or a holy sphere, it might profane it. And therefore what is holy could lose its holiness until it is ritually cleansed. There are examples of this in Numbers 19:20 and in Leviticus 21:12. So that's one possibility. That holiness is somehow fragile, so you need the separation. So if you've got a white shirt, you don't wear it to barbecue, if you want to keep it white. But there's another possibility. And in fact, the separation is not to do with the fragility of holiness, but it is to do with signaling that we belong to a transcendent God. That we belong to a creator who is different from creation. And so by maintaining that separation, we signal something about this God of ours. But there is a third view. And in fact, the separation is not to do with the fragility of holiness, that you're worried that your righteousness will get stained. Rather, it is to do with the dangerous power of holiness. And that brings us to the second of our nuances. The idea of holiness as energy, or holiness as a destructive power. One of my former tutors, Gordon Thomas, in an article, A Holy God Among a Holy People in a Holy Place, says this. In priestly tradition, the separation required by holiness has more to do with its destructive power than its fragility. In Thomas's view, God willed to live among God's people, but for their safety, there needed to be a cordon sanitaire, a safe space, so that the holy God could meet with the sinful people without the sinful people being consumed. And God graciously provided this safe place in the tent of meeting. And you'll find more about that, of course, in Exodus 14. We certainly do have examples of holiness as a destructive power in various places. You might remember the story of Uzzah in 2 Samuel 6. Chapter 6 to 11, as the Ark of the Covenant is being transported, and he puts his hand to steady it, and he is consumed. We might think about the plague which follows the golden calf episode. We might think about the swallowing up of the house of Korah following their rebellion against Moses in Numbers 16:23 and following. And so there is clearly some nuance within priestly tradition of this idea of the holy God being just a little bit dangerous. And you need to think about how you encounter that holy God. And related to this idea of holiness as energy or holiness as destructive power, this idea that holiness is affective, is the idea of holiness as contagion. That sounds really terrible, you know. Holiness as an infectious disease. That's not quite what I mean. The idea that contact with the holy makes objects and places and people holy. This idea that holiness is not infectious, but affective. It changes things around it. John Hartley, in his commentary on Leviticus, says this: God's holiness is contagious. Wherever God's presence is, that place becomes holy. So whether that is a burning bush in Exodus 3, whether that is the bronze censers that are used before the Ark of the Covenant in Numbers 16, these places and objects become holy because they come into contact with the Holy God. And finally, this is an important element, because he argues because only God is intrinsically holy, Any person or anything is only holy as it stands in relation to the Holy One. And so there are, if you like, degrees of holiness, depending on the proximity of an item or a person to the altar. Well, certainly that is a priestly understanding. And of course, if you think about the layout of the Israelite temple, that is exactly the way in which it is laid out. So the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, is the bit that is closest to the Ark of the Covenant, for that is where God's concentrated presence is. And all the way over there, that's where the Gentiles come in. And the furthest point. And unfortunately, if you're a woman, you're somewhere in between extreme. Okay? So that's a very priestly understanding of holiness, that it is proximity to the holy that makes things more holy. And if that's true, it is this concentrated and contagious holiness in close proximity to Yahweh that becomes potentially destructive of those persons or things that are impure or unholy. And perhaps that is the way we should understand the Uzzah episode. And in touching the ark, there is an unfortunate collision between someone who is not ritually pure and the Holy God. And that brings us to the third strand of holiness thought in priestly tradition, the idea of holiness as otherness, as God's sphere. For if we think as the holy as being the core of who God is, and we'll come to that in a little more detail later on, it might be possible then to think about holiness as that which belongs to the sphere of God's being, or the sphere of God's activity. And if that's true, when we describe an object, when we describe a person, when we describe a place, when we describe a time as being holy, what we are saying broadly is that it is a statement of ownership. It is a statement of close association or proximity to God's presence. So let's think about the Sabbath, for example. The Sabbath is holy. It's not holy because it's done something, or because those 24 hours are somehow better than other 24-hour periods. No, it's holy because God rested on that day. And because God has declared ownership of the Sabbath. And that's what you find in Exodus 28 to 11. And that's why it's holy. Because God owns it in a very particular way. And so the Sabbath then reminds us of God's claim to ownership, not just of the Sabbath, of course, but of all time. And what about Israel as a holy people? Now, anybody who's read the Old Testament will know that they are not a holy people because they're really good. They're not a holy people because they keep the commandments faithfully. They're not a holy people because they are better than the other nations around them. They are a holy people because they belong to God, because He has chosen them. So it's not their moral or ethical distinctiveness that marks them, because they have been chosen by God and are holy, that they are to be morally and ethically distinctive from the nations around them. So they are to be holy as God is holy. And that brings us to a subplot within this idea of holiness as otherness, or the divine sphere. Because if the people of God are holy, by virtue of belonging to the divine sphere, what that suggests to me, at least, is that their holiness is primarily a corporate holiness rather than a personal and individual one. Now that's a really challenging thing for me, coming from the holiness tradition, which has emphasized personal holiness. And that's an important thing. I will happily defend that. And yet, When we look at holiness within priestly tradition, it seems to me their understanding of it is primarily corporate. So the fact that Israel is a holy people does not necessarily imply that each individual within the community has experienced personal holiness. And it doesn't take a genius to read the pages of the Old Testament to see that that is true. In fact, the reason that we have a sacrificial system indicates that God does not presuppose that every individual in this community is going to be holy. In fact, the other way around seems to be true. The sacrificial system is built on the presupposition that there will be some sinful people here. And here's a way of dealing with the sin. And for me, that's a really challenging concept. But it seems to me a very significant one within priestly understanding of holiness. So in Exodus 19:6, we find a reference to Israel as God's holy people. Leviticus 21:8, a similar reference. Numbers 8:17, another one. Deuteronomy 7:6 and 14:2. And I'd like to suggest that in all of these priestly texts, the idea of Israel as a holy people is primarily corporate and only secondarily individual. So the fact that they are God's holy people does not preclude the presence of sinful individuals among the community. And that's a paradoxical thing for us to wrap our brains around, and I'm still wrestling with it myself. The idea that there are sinful people among God's holy people. And the difficulty of wrapping our minds around it is not that we struggle to believe that it exists. We come to church all the time, we know that that's true. It's tying on the theological knots that is a little more challenging. And then fourthly and finally in priestly tradition, the idea of holiness as divine quintessence. And we talked about this last night in great detail. John Gammy asserts that holiness in Israel was not first and foremost something for human beings to achieve. Rather, it is that characteristic of ineffability possessed only by God, the Lord of hosts, the Holy One of Israel. And so God alone is holy, and anything else that may be termed as holy can only be so through the action of God's very self. So holiness then becomes a mark of the presence of the divine, or an indication of the presence of God's essential characteristic. And as we heard last night, priestly tradition certainly does not only instruct the people of God to be holy, but gives specific examples of what that means for them. And so Leviticus 19, for example, not particularly concerned with sacrifices or Sabbaths or sanctuary, but concerned with the poor, love for neighbours, integrity, justice. And we will find exactly the same theme if we go to Exodus 24 or if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 22. And what that says to me is that love and holiness are inextricably intertwined. You can't get the one without the other. Love and holiness are inextricably intertwined. Holiness can only be tangibly expressed and experienced in love. Leviticus 19, 9-13 talks about this. Deuteronomy 24, verses 20-22, and Exodus 22, 21-31 is all about this. And what this thus means is this: that holiness for humans is imitatio Dei, that old Latin phrase, imitating God, trying to be like God. Now, this is where I want to introduce something that I will come back to, because it seems to me if all of this is true, it suggests that in priestly tradition, holiness is not primarily a moral term or an ethical term. I'm not suggesting that it is amoral because of what I just said, that holiness and love are inextricably intertwined. But it is to say that we can't simply collapse holiness into morals. You won't find the holy without morality, but it is possible to find morality without holiness. So let's summarize priestly tradition then. It seems to me that holiness is described in priestly tradition using a multiplicity of morals. And I think that that's appropriate because holiness is complex. If we truly believe that holy is what we mean when we say God, how else could it be other than complex? And therefore no single model will be sufficient. But we can begin to draw some conclusions. First, holiness is God's very being. It's who God is. And it seems to me that understanding of holiness underpins the other three priestly nuances of separation, of holiness as power, and holiness as belonging. For example, if holiness is who God is, if it is divine quintessence, well, it implies a close identification between purity and power. For God is both pure and powerful. If holiness is who God is, it makes sense of this idea of the holy being a mark of belonging to the divine sphere. If that's who God is, I don't know if I'm in the right part of the US. Are there any cattle ranchers around Mississippi? Anybody does that down here? No? Not so much? Well, you understand it anyway. If you're a cattle rancher, you brand it with your mark, so that people know it's yours. If God's going to brand us with a mark, it's going to be not the double, whatever it is, corral, it's going to be the double holiness second blessing corral that we get marked with. Does that make sense? If holiness is who God is, then objects or persons, spaces or times which are described as holy can only be so because they belong to the Holy One, and therefore in some way reflect or share in God's holiness. So that's a brief introduction into holiness in priestly tradition. There's more that can be said, but I hope that gives us an idea of some of the nuances of them. So we go on then to holiness in prophetic tradition. And it seems to me that this is a development of holiness in priestly tradition. But what is very striking about the prophets is the prophetic linking of holiness and social justice. Now that's not new. In fact, we talked about that just now, and we talked about that last night. Leviticus 19 says, "Be holy as I am holy," and then gives a whole set of things that they must do. Looking after the poor, not exploiting female slaves, looking after people with disabilities with dignity, and so on. And the prophet simply heightened that strand of thinking. Gordon Thomas says this: the repeated ministry of the prophets during the monarchy is to call Israel back to Torah, back to their true vocation of being a holy nation in a holy place among whom a holy God lives. Now, when we think about holiness in priestly tradition, it seems to me that Leviticus stands out, and that's one of the reasons I've made so many references to it. But when we think about holiness in prophetic tradition, it is Isaiah that stands out. Among the prophets is, well, first of all, its size, it's just so big. But secondly, because of its repeated use of the language of holiness. If you're bored sometime, look at a concordance, particularly one of those that has Hebrew or Greek words, and look up the word kadosh in Hebrew or hagios in Greek. And you will discover very quickly that Isaiah makes far more use of those terms and the cognate words that go with them than any other prophetic book in Scripture. And Chris Wright says this. He says, among the prophets, there are these two aspects that stand out. First, their theological basis for their work. And second, the social bias for their work. And he says the theological basis for the ministry of the prophets is God. God is the axiom and presupposition for all that the prophets do or say. In other words, the prophet's starting point is, if our God is Yahweh, how are we to behave? But secondly, there is this social bias, that the prophets are uniformly on the side of the poor, on the side of the weak, on the side of the oppressed, on the side of the dispossessed. And you can see this bias very easily in Hebrew Bible among the latter prophets like Isaiah and Amos. But we also see it in the former prophets. Think about Nathan, a prophet who didn't get a book named after him, but lots of little boys get named after him. And he's the prophet who came to David immediately after the Bathsheba incident, when David had taken someone else's wife, had Uriah murdered, thought he got away with it, and it was Nathan who came back to him with those wonderful and challenging words after his parable to say, "You are the man." And that's not in the sort of basketball sense, you know, who's the man, not that kind of thing. But you are the man who was sinning. We see it too in Elijah, the greatest prophet never to have a book named after him. Particularly when he confronts Ahab the king, because he has murdered Naboth, or had him murdered, so that he can take his field. The prophets stand on behalf of the poor and the powerless against the power of the powerful. And so under these two headings then, theological basis and social bias, let's think a little bit about holiness in prophetic tradition. When we explore holiness in prophetic tradition, perhaps the most significant prophetic designation for God is the Holy One of Israel. It's Isaiah's favorite way of describing God. And whatever your views about who wrote Isaiah, whether it's one author or three, in all three sections of Isaiah you find the same designation. You find it, for example, in Isaiah 1:4, right at the beginning of the book, 5:19, 10:17, 41:20, 54:5, and so on. But Isaiah is not the only one who uses this phrase. You find it in Jeremiah 50:29 and 51:5. You find it in Ezekiel 39:7. You find it in Habakkuk 1:12 and 3:3. You find it in Hosea 11:9. For the prophets, above all, whatever else might be a designation for their God, Yahweh is the Holy One of Israel. And all of those words are important. God is not just the Holy One, but the Holy One of Israel. There is a covenant relationship. And therefore the holiness to which the prophets wish to call Israel is based on the standards of the Holy One, to which they are pointed by the prophets. And so this is not a novelty, this is not a newfangled idea. It's part of their identity, part of their heritage. If you are Israel, say the prophets, you must be like the Holy One of Israel. Barton argues that the prophets, therefore, don't present people with previously unknown moral injunctions. The prophets are not interested in offering new ideas. They are interested in calling people back to things they should have known already. It seems to me that is what a prophetic ministry is. It's saying, you know who you should be. This is not news, people. So go and be it. I'm not informing you of this. I'm reminding you of stuff that you should know well enough already. And therefore the ministry of the prophets presumes the theology of the covenant. Since we are the people of God, this is how we are to behave. And so the prophets take for granted the essential nature of God, who is described as the Holy One of Israel. In Isaiah 6, of course, you have that wonderful, wonderful passage of Scripture. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. And of course, there are beings surrounding God simply saying, holy, holy, holy. The Trisagion. Walter Mulberry says this, that triple repetition, holy, 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 is an emphatic formulation. It is tantamount to a definition of Yahweh, and as such its sense is well captured by the later formulation in the book of Isaiah, that God's name is holy. And I have to say, the way I read that is not merely to say that God's name is holy in the way that you might say a place is holy, but actually to say that's who God is, that's what his name is. If he's going to have a business card, he's going to have on it holy. So if Mulberry is right, and I think he is, the prophets take the holiness of God as a given. And if that's true, then the things of God must naturally also be holy. And you find that very strongly through the prophetic books, especially in Isaiah. So you have all sorts of references to God's holy mountain, or God's holy arm, or God's holy temple, holy anger, holy name, holy land, holy habitation, holy angels. The prophets take for granted that the things of God are holy. And if it is true that God's mountain is holy, his arm is holy, his temple is holy, his anger is holy, his name is holy, land is holy, habitation is holy, angels are holy, what do you think is the expectation of God's people? That they too are to be holy. That's the theological basis. All that they do is rooted in this deep, profound belief that the God that they serve is the Holy One of Israel. And therefore God's people are to be holy as God is holy. Moreover, God's people can only be holy because of the gracious act of the Holy One of Israel. Their holiness is derived from God's. And you'll find that in 1 Samuel 2, you'll find it in Deuteronomy 7:6, in Exodus 31:3, in Leviticus 27, in Ezekiel 37:28. So that's the theological basis. But let's talk now about the social bias. Because you see, if human holiness is derived from divine holiness, then the nature of human holiness is necessarily informed by the nature of God. That's pretty obvious. And that is one of the reasons that the nature of human holiness as understood by the prophets is so linked with moral. This is where we come back to that circle where I say we can't collapse holiness into morals, but we can't have holiness without morals. And that's an important tension to hold on. Two puts it this way, he says it is false to reduce the holiness of God to moral categories alone. But at the same time we recognize that morality exemplifies holiness. Now, I confess that I have a bit of a bugbear here, so maybe I am over-egging the pudding. Does that phrase translate? Partly because I grew up with a tradition that very much tended to do that. Where the easy way to focus on holiness was to focus on morals. And what you then end up with is a nice legalism. So you have a list of acceptable behaviours, and if you simply do those, you're good to go. But as experience has taught so many of us over the years, it is possible to do all the right things and still be very far from the Holy One. So we can't collapse holiness into morals. Not only that, it is interesting the blind spots we have around morality. And so even if we could collapse holiness into morals, what we think is moral is interesting. So I grew up in a very teetotal church. You know, drinking of alcohol was definitely sinful. There's no grey area there. But I grew up in the Caribbean. If you've been to the Caribbean, you understand that we love rum cake. So it was this interesting anomaly that you can't drink alcohol, but put it in a cake and that's okay. Alright, we don't drink alcohol, but we eat it. It's fascinating the blind spots that we can work around. So, moral integrity is synonymous with holiness, yes, to a certain extent. But we must never fall into the trap of thinking that that's all that holiness is. So what is holiness? Well, for the prophets, the social bias means this: that holiness in Israel was a summons to Israel to aspire to justice, aspire to compassion, because these are characteristic of the godly sons. That's what we want, because we aspire to be like the God who calls us into holiness. And it seems to me, therefore, that it is no coincidence that the role of the prophet comes to the fore during the time of the monarchy, because the prophets, by and large, address themselves to the powerful on behalf of the powerless, urging the powerful to reconnect the ideas of justice and holiness. That's certainly the case in Amos. For Amos, his audience was the community in general, but the leadership in particular. And Amos spoke to those with privilege and with power about the nature of obedience to God in a world that is ultimately ruled by God. And therefore prophetic tradition articulates an understanding of holiness that is resolute in its demand that all can have a place, including those on the margins. That's not just true of Amos. You find it in Ezekiel 11. You find it even in Jonah. The whole story of Jonah is about the idea that these Ninevites, that Jonah thinks are so terrible that they should be destroyed, even they can have a place. You find it in Micah, you find it in Habakkuk. It seems to me that's a really important development. Because when we read priestly texts, particularly as they explain all the purity regulations, the priestly texts can seem very keen to exclude all sorts of people from the sphere of the holy. So if you are a leper, you need to keep your distance. If you are a menstruating woman, keep your distance. If you are in some other way ceremonially unclean, keep your distance for the woman. If you are lame, keep your distance. You can't enter the sphere of the holy. But the prophets want to push in the other direction, to say something about an inclusive model of holiness that says everyone can have a place. And we'll come back to this, because it seems to me that this has a missional element. That holiness at its very core is about reaching out to God's creation. That's the 360 movement. From God to creation, to draw creation back to God. And so if the trisagion, the holy, holy, holy of Isaiah 6, exemplifies the theological basis of the prophetic understanding of holiness, I suggest we need to look to Isaiah chapter 35, which for me typifies the social bias for Isaiah's view of holiness, because it is inextricably bound up with that of social justice. Now, Isaiah 35, I suspect, is far less well known than Isaiah 6. We all know the holy, holy, holy. So I want to read to you a bit from Isaiah 6, from verse 6. A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. Now this bit that I'm about to read becomes really important. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveller, not even fools, shall go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall attain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Now, if you do have your Bibles, you might notice that there is a little footnote next to 35:8b, where it says, "The unclean shall not travel on it." There is an alternative translation, which is simply, "They shall not pass it by." I want to come back to that for a moment. Because this idea of the holy way in Isaiah 35, it is a unique expression. We don't find it anywhere else in prophetic tradition, and certainly nowhere else in scripture. So we don't know what it means. We don't have another reference point to say, well, the holy way in this place means this, so it must mean that in Isaiah 35. And therefore, it is from the context in which it is being used that we have to figure out what it means. Walter Harrelson, in a really important article, I think, called Isaiah 35 in Recent Research and Translation, he says this. He argues for a novel understanding of Isaiah 35:8b. He says the version that's in the footnote, "pass it by" rather than "travel on it," is probably the better translation of the original language. So the way in which it reads at the moment, it says, "There is a holy way, and the unclean shall not pass on it. They shall not travel on it. They are prohibited." But actually, he says it is the alternative translation. They shall not pass it by. In other words, they shall not fail to see the holy way, which is much more important. Because he says, if you understand it in that way, what we have is this idea of a holy way leading the people of God back to God, which allows even people who are unclean on it. Because in fact, you see earlier in the chapter, just a few verses earlier, it talks about the eyes of the blind being opened, the ears of the deaf being unstopped, the lame leaping like a deer, the tongue of the speechless singing for joy. These are all excluded categories who will find their way back to God.